Okay, I got the message that we are live. So welcome to CelloChat. I'm Eric Kim. I'm broadcasting from my studio in my home in Bloomington, Indiana. And I wanted to maybe start the CelloChat by talking about Lynn Harrell. He was my teacher for 3 years at Juilliard. And it turns out that I went to Juilliard to study with Leonard Rose, and then Mr. Rose got sick in my second year there. I had met Lynn 2 summers before in Aspen at the music festival there, and developed a relationship, played arrangement, Laszlo Varga's arrangement of Bach Chaconne for 4 celli that summer, and so we kept in touch, and I contacted him when Mr. Rose was near the end, which was also very sad. And he said that he would take me as a student for my remaining time at Juilliard. And that was my middle of my junior year, and I did a 1-year master's with him as well. So he was a huge influence, as you can imagine, in my life. And so I'm happy to field any questions about maybe the impact he made. We were friends all the way till the end. So unfortunately, for my students, he was actually going to be coming here in October for a couple weeks to teach for me. So that's something that I'm very sad for my students not to have that experience. So I'm happy to field any questions about my relationship with him over the years. Okay, here's something. Okay, so the question is, how did Mr. Harrell affect your approach to music? You may or may not know that his background, his father was a singer at the Met. So he was very much of the approach that when he played the cello, it was more like a voice, whether he was singing or speaking. And he actually made that very apparent in our lessons, that he wanted me to think of the instrument not as a cello, but as well, basically he said the bow is your voice, and I totally believe that to this day. I remember one time he actually gave me an assignment to study the first act of Magic Flute, and just to be aware of how, first of all, how great Mozart was, to understand the composer, and to see, when you see a score, you get to see how the composer develops everything together. And that's how his approach was to music, and it obviously became part of my blood to approach music like that also. Next. Okay, here's another question. What are the practice principles that Mr. Harrell introduced to you? So practice principles, I think I would say just that I got a lot of discipline from him. I wouldn't say per se that they were all practice principles that I got from him. I got many interesting ideas from him because of his approach to that the cello is not an instrument, actually. I'll say that there were 3 things that he really affected in my life where I didn't know that was possible on the cello, was to learn how to play softly, beautifully. I think that was one of his fortes, that everyone thinks about how big a sound he had, and yes, he had an enormous sound, but he also had the most beautiful pianissimo, and I think that's one of the big things I got from him. Another thing was just being efficient while I played. Not extra motions. If you watch him play, he moves the appropriate amount for the music, and nothing excessive, nothing held back, but just keeping fingers very close to the string. And if you can see the way his hands move, there's a sense of gliding all the time. And then lastly, pizzicato. He's the one that told me, hey, Eric, your finger is no different than your bow, and your different fingers produce different sounds. I never thought to practice pizzicato much. And then once I got into an orchestra, I realized that, oh, wow, that's really an important thing to have. So those are the three main things that I took from Lynn in practice and in approach. So hope that answered your question. Next question. Okay. What was the most valuable piece of advice you ever received from Mr. Harrell? He said to me, when I was studying at Juilliard, of course, we all think we're going to be, the next Lynn Harrell or Yo-Yo or whatever. He was very realistic, which I try to do with my students as well. He said, if you want to play concerti, you want to play recitals, get principal cello of a major orchestra if you can, and that will be a vehicle for you to play concerts if that's something you want to do, and then you'll make money while you're at it as well. So he was very pragmatic, very practical. I followed in the footsteps of him and our teacher, Leonard Rose, and it was a lovely, wonderful career, and I'm so glad that I did it. So I think that was the best piece of advice. He said, consider orchestra. It's a wonderful way to be a musician and to make a living. So that was that. Okay, then the next question. How did Mr. Harrell encourage you to develop your own unique voice as an artist? Well, as I said earlier, he didn't say play it like this. I guess I didn't say that earlier, but I'm saying that now, is that he gave you many options. Obviously, he and I was not built the way he is. I'm 5'8". He was like 6'4", 6'2", I think. But, enormous sausage fingers. The bow looked like a toothpick in his hand. So it's not that I could emulate everything that he was doing on the cello that was going to make me, be me. I had to find out by just watching him and to see the inspiration that he gave me, that what are the things that are going to make me better. So he planted all those seeds when I was studying with him, and then fortunately when I left school, those seeds started to develop, and they kind of clicked here and there, and eventually, I feel like I found my own style. So he was the person who nurtured that in you when you didn't even know it, actually. Okay. The next question is, can you explain some of the things Mr. Harrell talks about regarding how to make a big, powerful sound with ease? What are the components he focused on in this regard? Well, it was easy for him to play with a big sound because he was a big guy. But he did talk about balance a lot. There were times where you get to a certain bow that you have to think to sustain. He was really into sustaining all the way to the tip. He got me to practice starting at the tip many times when it was a down bow, just to make sure that I always had enough weight in the bow when I started. That's one thing that I find a lot of people don't think about, is the upper half of the bow, and he made me very well aware of how to make the upper half as comfortable as the lower half as far as playing with a big sound went. So I hope that answered your question. Okay, next question, a non-Lynn related question. What advice do you have for someone who doesn't know if he should go to university to study the cello or do something else? Well, that's a good question. I think a lot of us educators get that type of question. I think the difficulty in answering something like that is, there are no guarantees in playing an instrument and going to a university versus a conservatory. Every individual is different. So I have a kind of a strong belief that if you're questioning it, that maybe you should do something else if you're good at something else. I think it's very, very difficult to make a living with music, and I feel incredibly fortunate. I know all of my colleagues feel fortunate that we're able to support ourselves with something that we love to do. And I would encourage you to try as much as you can, but hopefully you have the right guidance that lets you know whether it's a good decision or not. I must say I have a lot of former students that are medical doctors or about to be medical doctors that I'm very proud of, that they took it upon themselves to know what that limit of, okay, I'm going to push myself, but am I going to push myself at something else because I'll do better at that. So I think having good guidance along the way and being smart and thinking about those things is very important. Okay, I guess we're moving on to, when you start working on a new obscure piece, where do you start? How do you approach it, especially if you can't find any background information or recordings? It's a very interesting question. I can't really give a definitive answer to say that, methodically this is how I work on every new piece. I think a lot of it has to do with the genre. What are the complexities in the piece? Is it pure technical? Is it a balance of lyrical and technical? If it's something that I can grasp fairly quickly, I like to take things in sections, and I like to recognize how the composer wrote it. So are there a lot of similar passages that you can work on at the same time? I tell my students, practice like with like. Take a section that's very similar to another section so you can grasp the character of what that is, whether it be lyrical or technical, articulation. These are all things that blend into approaching a new piece. Okay, do you have advice on expanding a cellist vibrato color palette? I can't tell if that's a separate question. Do you have advice on expanding a cellist vibrato color palette? I find vibrato to be such an integral part of what we do. It's funny because what I encourage for vibrato is to not vibrate, actually, to find color without vibrato first. So any lyrical passage, I would highly recommend that you try practicing without vibrato, so you actually hear what you're doing with your bow. And then once you feel like you're phrasing with the bow, then you can figure out, okay, how is vibrato going to help that? I also have a specific vibrato exercise that I give my students to develop different speeds and widths, and to feel very comfortable with different parts of the instrument, because obviously first position and thumb position feel very differently. So I hope that answers your question as far as vibrato. The next question: what are your few core principles you encourage your students to focus on in the practice room, and what top 3 technical concepts do you find students have the most trouble grasping? Okay, that's a loaded question. A few core principles, that's kind of hard to just kind of put in a little sack. Three technical concepts do you find students have the most trouble grasping? I think vibrato is certainly one of them. I think spiccato is another one of them. Developing a really good spiccato takes great patience, and learning to start the bow from above the string rather than always feeling it grounded. I think there with spiccato that it works best. It's spiciest when you can actually start it from above the string, and you can get lots of different articulations that way. And then I would say sustaining sound. So vibrato, sustaining sound, and spiccato. I think those are the three things that I encounter most with students that I try to work on. If I'm going to squeeze one, maybe write another one that's even with that is shifting. My colleagues and we all have, I think, different ideas that all work with shifting. I have specific ideas about shifting on new fingers, old fingers, the speed and the release. That I could spend hours on alone, shifting as well. So those would be the main principles that I would say that are important in playing. What I would like to stress is that I find the importance of a good warm-up is really, really important. Not just scales. I do scales with different bowings. I do different, like slow vibrato, fast vibrato. I do octave shifts, 1 to 1 to 1. I do 2 to 2 to 2. I do threes, and then I do 4 to 3, and then I do 1 to 2. We never know what fingering is going to work best in the music. So I think having good variety in how you shift octaves, how you practice octaves, how you practice thirds, it's all very valuable. I practice popper every day. I think it's just such a great resource for us as cellists. So these are some fundamental things that I think are really important to playing the instrument well. Okay. Next question. This is good. What is your favorite non-cello related memory of Mr. Harrell? So we used to play sports together. He was an amazing tennis player. He had a forehand that would, if it hit your racket, it would basically break your arm. It just had so much power behind it, and lots of topspin. So I enjoyed playing tennis with him. He thoroughly kicked my butt, so that wasn't fun. But it's kind of hard to play your teacher and think you're going to beat him too, But my favorite memory is us golfing together. He was such a student of everything that he did: chess, tennis, golf, and it's so apparent how he played the cello, because the way he approached playing golf was the way he played the cello. He thought of the mechanics of it, and then beyond the mechanics, how emotion helps you play. He was such a passionate golfer. I just remember having several rounds playing with Lynn that were, it was a different learning experience than the cello, for sure. Okay. Next message. How do you keep various technical elements in check when practice time is not much? Do you have some exercises? Oh, maybe that's a separate question. How do you keep various technical elements in check when practice time is not much? Again, that's a kind of a general question that's difficult to ask without knowing context. I'm going to guess by the way you wrote it that, let's say you have an hour, let's say you're working on the last movement of the Elgar Concerto, and the question is, how much of the repertoire do you plan on playing in that hour? I highly recommend getting one page unbelievably good rather than get three pretty good. I think what I've learned from my teachers over the years that it's all in the details, and I think it's really important to take the time to practice incredibly carefully, even if it's in a short amount of time. Again, I tell my students when you're working on a passage, there's the rule of three and there's the rule of five. I'm sure tons of my colleagues have the same. Is that if you're not nailing a passage three times in a row, don't think about going ahead. You're not playing it yet. And if you really want to be disciplined, then it becomes the rule of five and you do it five times. Now, you might say, well, I'd never leave the practice room. Okay, you'd never leave the practice room, but I think that's what's required when you practice. Okay. Do you have some exercises you can recommend? So, I am a strong proponent of using the fourth finger. I think that fourth finger is so valuable to playing, to have as many options as possible in your playing. So in order to do that, you need this muscle to be strong. And if that's not strong and it's weak, then I don't think that you have that extra option to play beautifully with your fourth finger. So I would practice Kosman, but instead of 1, 3, 2, 4, 3. If you don't feel that muscle sore within 10 minutes, then you're not doing yourself a favor, because that really builds up that muscle and really helps you feel that fourth finger is independent. So that's one of the exercises I think is really good for strengthening the fourth finger. I have, of course, other exercises, but in this short amount of time that we have, I think addressing the fourth finger is a big issue for us cellists. Okay. Can you explain how one approaches playing the jig from the first suite? How does one technically play the easy and free, but with the dancing and impulsive character? Well, let me grab my music here. Let's take a look. So, the dancing. So, I'm thinking that you've got two different characters between the slurs and then the spiccato notes. So I think you can approach, this is a general thing in Bach anyway, I think you can find lots of characters within long lines in Bach. And the difficulty I find in Bach is that many people like kind of micromanage and find so many things in short amounts of time that all of a sudden there's no long phrase. So I would say, to answer your question, but also in general with Bach, is to find the little things within a big phrase. It'll be much, it'll give you better purpose when you play Bach too. Okay, let me see, what's the next question? What was Mr. Harrell's advice and mentorship to you with regards to audition and competition preparation? Okay, that's a good question. Excuse me. Boy, he didn't specifically address, even though I was I took an audition studying with him. It was my first job coming out of school. My first job was principal of the then Denver Symphony. It's Colorado Symphony now. And he I don't know if the approach that he gave me was necessarily the correct one. For this particular audition, it was, but I don't know if I would say I would approach. I mean, he had not been in an orchestra for a long time, so the way he approached the excerpts were the way he played them as if he was by himself. So a lot of the dynamic things, I had to think about. Okay, obviously he's giving me more advice musically than anyone could. The practical side of me had to think, well, if it's pianissimo, I really can't. I should play as if I'm playing pianissimo in the orchestra, and that I really can't be heard. So there was a balance of me taking all of that musical knowledge from him and then turning it into a practical idea for auditions. And competitions, no problem, because he just said go for it and just be yourself. And I think that's probably the main thing I would say about auditions too, is that don't try to play like someone else. Play like you. People say, oh, if you're going to audition, for Cleveland, that you have to be super clean all the time, or if you play for Philly, that you have to play with a lush sound all the time. You know what? Hopefully, you play cleanly with a lush sound. So hopefully you've got all of it anyway. But I wouldn't recommend trying to match someone's style. I think you have to develop your own style and be convincing with that. So, okay. What's the next? Would you mind taking a minute about talking a minute about the bow hold and thumb placement? I had one professor that liked the thumb further back in the curve of the frog, and others, most in parenthesis, on the button of the button. Any recommendations on keeping the thumb relaxed and avoid cramping in the hand? Thank you. I've had students over the years that play with a straight thumb, and that helped them because they had super long fingers. Again, I can't give the same advice to every person because everyone's built slightly differently. Since my hands are not super long, I like the flexibility of a curved thumb. You can see that. I feel like it gives my bow grip a lot more just flexibility in the pronation, the supination. Again, these are Leonard Rose principles, and as you'll see with many of his disciples, that's something that we got from him, having that feel of flexibility. I think where my thumb rests is right on the frog in the corner there, where the wood meets the frog itself. And I have a dent in my thumb, as you can see, where the side of the frog meets the stick. And the stick is actually dented from my nail going into it. So that should give you a good idea where I like to rest my thumb. And again, I like the thumb bent just because it feels springier when I need it, and I can grip it firm when I need to also. So I hope that helped. Okay. Do you have a scale system that you recommend and teach? Yes, I do. It would probably, well, I can give you the Reader's Digest version, I guess. What I start with is just long tones with the Kalamian system, doing the third. So I probably, to save time, I'm not going to do the full length of that, but it's probably maybe 60 to a quarter, and I'll do 4 beats, four octaves going up and then back down, and then I'll take the next half step and then do an incredibly loose vibrato. This is my very first warm-up of the day. So the reason why I'm doing the slow scale is to feel like I'm getting my pads established. So I can feel exact positions where my fingers. So if I'm too fast, then I don't really get to feel the pads rooted there. So then the next scale, I'll do 2 notes to bow with a super loose vibrato. Again, just to start loosening up the elbow and the arm. I don't want to have any type of tension when I start the day. Then I'll do I'll just kind of do this feel, up bow staccato, down bow staccato, single notes, double notes, triple notes, just to feel like, you know, I can feel that both hands are working together. Then I do a slur 2. And then I do. So that's to help with a combination of slur, feeling the articulation, control, and coordination. But then it's also disciplining my bow distribution. So I like to feel that. And then I like to do E major. So multiple separate bows in different parts of the bow. Again, that's for bow control. Helps the spiccato too. And then I just continue with doing different things with vibrato and then bow. Like I'll do 3 eventually. So you get to feel different parts of the bow, different amounts of bow. And by the time I'm doing that, then I'm starting to feel pretty good about being able to vibrate at speed and really feeling like I've got decent control of the bow. That's a huge thing that I think maybe a lot of people don't get from just scales, that you're warming up your left hand a lot, but you're not really developing the right hand while you're doing that. Then I do scales, arpeggios. And then I like to do the shift on the same bow. Just so it feels like I've got the process of the shift happening in both hands that way. So that feels good to me. And then eventually I start mixing. So I can start feeling hand positions with major and minor. I don't know if that's helpful to you or not. And then next I practice, I told you how I practice the shiz. I think that's really helpful. And then by the time I'm doing that, I do a few popper etudes, random here and there. That should be about 40 minutes. So again, I'm not giving you the full version, but that should give you an idea that it warms both the left hand and the right hand together. So you should be ready to play anything, or feel like you should play anything after that. Yeah. Okay, sorry, that took a while. I think I'll move on to the next question. What is the most valuable thing you took away from playing in a professional orchestra? What age should one begin seriously learning excerpts? Should one wait until they are reasonably developed technically and artistically, or begin as soon as possible within reason? Okay, that's a good question. I started studying many excerpts, probably my senior year in college, and then took my first audition ever after studying excerpts for about a month. And it was just kind of an eye-opener that, it didn't feel like there was so much pressure because I knew I had another year in school. It just made the experience nicer. It felt more like I was performing rather than taking an audition. But I think learning excerpts, if I had learned excerpts sooner, that would have been better for my musical development also. Because when I teach orchestral excerpts, I highly recommend that people look at the score. So it's the same concept with when you play chamber music, or what Mr. Harrell had me do with studying magic flute. When you see a score, you know exactly what your role is in anything that you're playing. So I think it's really, really important that when you begin doing it correctly, not necessarily that you do it so early. But early would be good if you have the time to do that and study with the score. Then should one wait till? Yes, I think you should wait till you're reasonably developed technically. I'm not sure exactly what that means. I mean, my teacher growing up had me learn Don Juan when I was 12 years old. So, and she said, "You'll thank me someday," and I thanked her because I did need it eventually. And so I think it's really important to find that balance of learning. I mean, it's all music anyway, right? Playing excerpts, there are tricks that we have to know. We have to know with each excerpt what a committee is listening for. They all have something that we all zone in on, and so I think it's helpful for you to know that when you're approaching excerpts also. Okay. Next question. Okay. Could you explain your approach to Brahms' E minor cello sonata and your thoughts on its musical interpretation? Okay, boy, that's another kind of a broad question. The first movement is, to me, a piece onto itself. Of course, it's still in sonata form, but the way the material, the subjects come back in the different keys, even though it's the same material, I think the key structure makes it much more powerful to me than maybe other pieces that are written in classical sonata form. It's a huge journey. Anyone who's played it knows that your thumb's going to get pretty tired by the end, and not to worry if that's what's happening to you, because that's totally normal, and the stamina comes with time. So know that that's going to be better. The second movement, the minuet, pretty light. I think as long as you're grasping the character and feeling like you have variety in what those dotted eighth notes can do, I think that helps a lot. Sometimes when I've heard the second movement, it can be very monotonous, especially the trio. So my interpretation is to be as free as possible as long as your pianist is with you. So, of course, this is chamber music, so it's not all about you. It's a co-op, and yet you have to be able to play it so many times. And I think any sonata is like this, but the second movement in particular, the trio, I would say if you played this a million times with the same pianist, then the liberties that you both can take would be enormous because you know each other's sense of timing and style. So I think that's really important. The last movement is, I mean, they're all so different. So to me, the first movement has the most musical power, just because I think some of the tunes are some of the most beautiful tunes there are. The ending, I mean, the moment moments that it just gives me goosebumps thinking about all of these beautiful themes in the first movement. I don't necessarily think about that in the second or the third movements. The second, I think of how whimsical the minuet is and how free, carefree the trio is. And then the last movement, I think of it as a pugilist. For those who don't know what pugilist is, it's a boxer. You know, I think it's a very athletic movement, and I think you have to prepare for it that way too, because I think fatigue is a big issue in finishing that sonata as well. So, you know, having very distinct characters and, you know, assimilating them as you're playing it, I think it's really important in any piece. But in the Brahms, those are my thoughts anyway. So, okay, the next question. What was your process of preparation like for orchestral auditions? So I think at no point did I ever take a lot of auditions, so the music never got stale to me. I know that phenomena is rampant because, well, they're not happening now, but when auditions happen, a lot of times they happen within weeks of each other, so you have to be able to either pick and choose or have a wide range of the knowledge of the excerpts in your hands. So now that's something that as time goes becomes you know, it's just like second nature that you can whip out Don Juan or Heldenleben or Verdi Requiem because you've done it enough times. So I think all of the preparation is really important that you do. Sorry, I lost the question. Okay, the process of preparation. So again, I was talking about the excerpts getting stale. I think it's really important to keep them in your fingers, but never to the point where you say, "Oh God, I have to play La Mer again." You know, you should say, "I get to play La Mer again." The attitude in which you play the excerpts is huge in what is conveyed in an audition setting. I think regardless of whether you're behind a screen or not, that the preparation, it comes out whether you feel like it's stale or not. I would add to the part of the question that says the process of the preparation. I think people prepare the notes, the dynamics, the quality of sound. I think there are a lot of people out there that can do that really well. What separates the people that win the job? I think they're the ones that can play with the correct style. So I deliberately, when I put lists together, preliminary, semifinal, or final, I deliberately put Beethoven next to Debussy, next to Mozart, next to Verdi, just to see if the person was able to grasp the style of the music going from one short excerpt to the next. I think if you don't practice that, that's not a natural process because it's a lot easier for us to carry baggage from one excerpt to the next. So I would suggest practicing style when you're practicing everything else also. Okay. Next question is, can you please talk about how one learns spiccato bowing? Thank you so much for your time. I am happy to be here, by the way. Can you please talk about spiccato? Boy, got a few years. Spiccato is a very okay. So this is one of the things I learned from Lynn Harrell, spiccato. And if you ever get a chance to hear his spiccato, it's like a machine gun when it's loud, and it's I can't even describe when it was soft, but it was not. It could be the driest spiccato in the world, but it could also be the most singing spiccato. So spiccato has a great variety in it. There's a time and place. Let's say Stravinsky or Shostakovich when you need incredibly crispy dry spiccato, and then with Mozart where that spiccato is the British term they call that stroke onf because it's on and off at the same time. So I think that's a real that range in spiccato needs to be nurtured. And as I said earlier, learning how to practice spiccato with from above the string rather than from the string, and visually, I think a longer spiccato looks more like a U, and a shorter spiccato looks more like a V. So it's really in how you it's the angle in which you approach the string that I think makes a big impact. So again, just repetitive bowings. I tell my students all the time that, you know, spiccato didn't feel comfortable for me. It took me 2 years of playing just trying to get 4-octave scales clean. 2 years before that started to feel like I could get to the string crossings and each register to have at least a similar type of articulation. Okay, good. Let me see. What's the next question? You ever miss life playing with a professional orchestra? Not for a second, actually. And it's not because I didn't enjoy playing in the orchestra, but there's a reason why I left. And I really loved I played a year Denver, I played a year principal in San Diego, and then 20 years I was in Cincinnati. And I started teaching here, adjunct, I think maybe in my 18th year in Cincinnati, and then they were asking me if I'd be interested in teaching here, and I said, oh no, I'm not ready to be a teacher yet, because oftentimes the connotation for a teacher is someone that doesn't play, but we all know that's not the case. But the life of playing in an orchestra is different than just playing in an orchestra, and it's the life part that I wanted to get away from. I wanted to have more freedom in my life. I wanted to be able to hopefully pass on the next lineage from Mr. Rose and Mr. Harrell to students, and this life is so unlike the other life that I had, and I was lucky at the age of 44 to be able to say I had a complete career playing in an orchestra, and to feel now at 55 that, you know, I'm so grateful to be able to teach and play, mostly on my schedule, so that's kind of nice too. So, okay, next question. I am not very tall. Yeah, me neither. And I have quite short arms. I have noticed that reaching the high positions requires a little more parameters since I have to put some of my body on the body of the instrument. I understand that. The latter makes it more complex to achieve muscle memory to reach a high position. I use up my torso and my feet. Wow. Maybe you should take up the violin. No, I'm just kidding, sorry. What advice can you give me about it? Well, you know, with the scales, when you practice scales from low to high, and I don't know if you use a mirror when you play, the mechanics of how your body moves is so important to feel like you're balanced when you play. I would highly recommend practicing with a mirror, and mainly for your warm-up, but for any time when the position feels like it's getting strained, you can actually physically see what's happening that's inhibiting, you know, your motion. And yes, even though you have, you know, shorter limbs, I think there's generally a way to feel like you're maneuvering around the instrument. I don't have long arms either. I don't lift up my feet, but I do feel that when I go from low to high, that I'm not reaching around, but I think the elbow is kind of the key to making sure every position feels similar. I come across a lot of people who play with these low elbows that when you go to thumb position need this extra step of bringing up the elbow before you release. I like to feel there's something in sports called the ready position, that when you're standing, your knees are slightly bent and your arms are out in front of you. And I kind of feel that with the cello, that there has to be a ready position that gives you flexibility to move from one position to another. So I think the elbow helps that a lot, because then it really frees up the weight in the hand to release forward and backwards, actually. You might want to try a slightly higher elbow position to feel like you can release a little bit more. But then, ever since we've been doing the Zoom teaching, I practice with Zoom. It's awesome. You can host your own meeting. I flip the video on. I've got a 32-inch monitor, and I can see if my bow's tracking well, if it's skidding. I didn't realize how bad my bow was at the tip. So anyway, it's I think a very helpful tool to have also. Okay. Do you have any advice on practicing artificial harmonics for contemporary music? Well, the first bit of, or maybe the most, I would say about that is to making sure that you have a pretty darn good callus on your thumb. I remember playing a piano trio of Bright Sheng, and there's one movement that's nothing but artificial harmonics. And my thumb was basically bleeding because I didn't have a well enough defined callus before I learned the piece. I guess I should have learned it a month or so before to really develop the calluses, but I think that since that is your foundation, that's your base, make sure you get a really good callus on there before you even think about performing it. So maybe practicing it earlier would be helpful. And then also practicing it without the third finger down. I think having the third finger in place would be helpful, that you can just drop it and check what the note is, but to really feel that fundamentally that your thumb is creating the tone. Okay, the next question. Okay. What method can you recommend for coordination in fast movements on fast picado? For example, second variation, rococo, or fast passages in Vibrato and rondo. What method can you? You can practice scales. I mean, anything that, or popper six, anything that is fast that challenges your coordination. It's like you're not born to play fast. We're born to get there to play fast, right? So I think the main thing is to play it really well, slower, and then work on your coordination between the two hands. Because oftentimes what I'll see is that most of the time I see a left hand gets faster than the right hand, and the right hand can't keep up. So be aware of what your tendencies are as you increase the speed, and then know that if your right hand's a little bit slower, try to lead the passage with your bow as opposed to your left hand. I think we don't think enough about, which hand is helping out which hand. I mean, they always work together somehow. That includes in shifting. I'm a strong believer in shifting with the bow rather than the hand. That way you feel a lot more coordination in a shift. So I would do the same with your fast practicing as well. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, do you have any advice on how to prevent the fourth finger from curling up when playing in thumb position? Wow. That feels really weird. does it naturally bend? That's what I've come across several people who do have that fourth finger. Actually, one of my former students who graduated last year plays with a finger like that, and his response to that is that he never knew it shouldn't. So my question is, what is the fourth finger doing when it's curling up? Is it locking your other fingers? I'm not exactly sure if you're saying the fourth finger is preventing you from playing well in thumb position or not. Let's assume that that's the case. And again, I'm a firm believer in hand positions, uniform hand positions. So maybe practicing when you're on the third finger, or when you play maybe play the extra whole step on your fourth finger. So when you're playing three, that your fourth position is your fourth finger is more in a ready position rather than something that's out of position. That could be a good exercise that helps you. Okay, good. Do you have any advice for a tight right thumb while playing? What is your approach to the bow hold, and also how the arm and rest of the body relates to it? Okay. Okay. So, first thing I do is I ask my students if they can do this. So that's maintaining your bow grip and just flipping your wrist over. You're not doing anything else. You're just flipping the wrist over and seeing if you can hold onto the bow still. Now, if you don't want to break your bow because you're afraid that might happen, do it with a pencil first. See if you can actually keep the same bow grip on a pencil. That tells me whether your grip is stable or not. I find that many times that people can't do that because there are dominant fingers happening in the bow grip. I feel absolutely 4 top fingers and 1 lower finger absolutely balanced. So I don't call it a bow hold because I think that's a hold. I call it a bow grip because I think when the bow rests on the string, regardless of what position you're in, that if you're able to use all of your fingers, then you can control different parts of the bow easier. So I would say that your grip needs to be flexible, but it also needs to be firm enough to control different parts of the bow. If you're loose in any point with at the tip, you wouldn't be able to start forte at the tip. So it's all making sure that you have good balance in your bow grip. Okay. All right. Another question. What was your very first time meeting Lynn Harrell, and what were your first impressions? Well, I was intimidated. I was, I said this at the beginning of the session, that I first met him when I was 17 at the Aspen Music Festival. And he was a guest artist, and he was playing some cello chamber music. And I remember the other, Peter Wyrick, who's the associate principal in San Francisco, and Talia Moore, who was his student at Juilliard at the time. She's, I think, in the San Francisco Opera now. And then I was also playing, we were playing the Bach Chaconne arranged for 4 cellos by Laszlo Varga. And I can't even describe the awe that I experienced first just meeting him and talking to him, because obviously he was, luminary, and here I this punk, high school kid about ready to go to Juilliard. The sounds that came out of that cello, I'd never heard anything like that. I probably won't hear anything like that again. So unique to him. I said also earlier, the range in which he could play from the most beautiful soft that just kind of draws you in. It's mesmerizing to hear that kind of sound, and then the pure power of like this bass trombone sound next to you. To have that range, I think it just gives you every opportunity to be able to articulate what you want to say so much easier. So maybe in conclusion, I should say that you know, generate ranges, great ranges of things, dynamics, articulations, emotions. I think they will serve you well rather than to keep everything in a small box. Okay, I think that ends the questions. If you can give any closing remarks, that would be great. And I will let you know once the live broadcast is concluded. Well, I guess that's what I was saying is, you know, it's how apropos the last question, you know, asking me about my impressions of Mr. Harrell. You know, they directly affected how I approached music and life. You can't really separate the two, right? If you're a happy-go-lucky person, you probably sound like it on the instrument. Then, and if you've never had tragedy before, then you probably don't know how to play with tragedy. So seek what you don't have. Cherish what you do have. And I think it will serve you well to have more feelings to tap from when you're playing. And that's not a technical thing. So, okay, well, I want to thank you all for being here. Was extremely happy to be here to answer your questions. And please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions.